Hi, so for my author, poet, illustrator study, I decided to choose Dave Pilkey, who is both an illustrator and an author. Dave Pilkey has over 60 books. Some of his include Captain Underpants, Dog Man, and Super Diaper Baby, which I also have here. When Dave was younger, he was often seen as a troublemaker because he had an attention deficit disorder and also dyslexia. And when he was younger, those weren't really seen as disorders, so he was just seen as a troublemaker. And he had a desk in the hallway for him to go pretty much every day. And that's where he came up with all of his comic books like Captain Underpants. One day, when he was writing his book, Captain Underpants, the teacher came and took it from him and ripped it up and told him that he couldn't write comic books for a living. And so he was seen as a troublemaker all through high school also. And when he got to college, he was doodling in one of his college classes, and his professor came over to him and asked what he was doing. Well, he thought he was going to get in trouble, but when she looked at it, she said, "That is awesome. That is amazing. You should do this for a living." And so that's what he did, and that one person is what inspired him. So he kind of shows people that you just need one person to really inspire you, and that there will be people that don't like what you do, but there will be some that think your work is great and want you to keep doing more of it. And so I have a book here I'm going to read, Adventures of Captain Underpants. This is the first one, and so I'm just going to read you a few chapters of it. Okay, so Chapter 1, George and Harold. Meet George Beard and Harold Hutchins. George is the kid on the left with the tie and the flat top. Harold's the one on the right with a t-shirt and bad haircut. Remember that now? Flower shop. Pick your own roses. George and Harold were best friends. They had a lot in common. They lived right next door to each other, and they were both in the same 4th grade class at Jerome Horwitz Elementary School. George and Harold were usually responsible kids. Whenever anything bad happened, George and Harold were usually responsible. Pick your noses. But don't get the wrong idea about these two. George and Harold were actually very nice boys. No matter what everybody else thought, they were good, sweet, and lovable. Well, okay, maybe they weren't so sweet and lovable, but they were good, nonetheless. It's just that George and Harold each had a silly streak a mile long. Usually that silly streak was hard to control. Sometimes it got them into big trouble, and once it got them into big, big trouble. But before I can tell you that story, I have to tell you this story. Chapter 2, Treehouse Comics Incorporated. After a hard day of cracking jokes, pulling pranks, and causing mayhem at school, George and Harold liked to rush to the old treehouse in George's backyard. Inside the treehouse were 2 big old fluffy chairs, a table, a cupboard crammed with junk food, and a padlocked crate filled with pencils, pens, and stacks of paper. Now Harold loved to draw and George loved to make up stories, and together the 2 boys spent hours and hours writing and drawing their very own comic books. Over the years, they have created hundreds of their own comics, starring dozens of their own superheroes. First, there was Dog Man, and then there was Timmy the Talking Toilet, and who could forget the Amazing Cow Lady? But the all-time greatest superhero that they ever made up had to be the amazing Captain Underpants. George came up with the idea. Most superheroes look like they're flying around in their underwear, he said. Well, this guy actually is flying around in his underwear. The 2 boys laughed and laughed. Yeah, said Harold, he could fight with wedgie power. George and Harold spent entire afternoons writing and drawing the comic adventures of Captain Underpants. He was their coolest superhero ever. Luckily for the boys, the secretary at Jerome Horwitz Elementary School was much too busy to keep an eye on the copy machine. So whenever they got a chance, Harold and George would sneak into the office and run off several hundred copies of their latest Captain Underpants adventure. After school, they sold their homemade comics on the playground for 50 cents each. Chapter 3, The Adventures of Captain Underpants, written by George Beard, cartoons by Harold Hutchins. It was a time of darkness and despair for planet Earth. Bad guys had taken over the streets, and all of the superheroes in the world were too old to fight evil. Hey, ha-ha! Then came a new improved extra strength superhero. Tra-la-la! Look up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's an egg salad sandwich. No way, I'm Captain Underpants. Captain Underpants was faster than a speeding waistband. Zoom! More powerful than boxer shorts, and able to leap tall buildings without getting a wedgie. Tra-la-la! Night and day, Captain Underpants watched over the city, fighting for truth, justice, and all that is pre-strunk and cottony. Meanwhile, at a nearby elementary school, it was Stinky Taco Surprise Day at the cafeteria. Yuck! Everybody hated it so much they all threw it away. Soon the cafeteria food came to life. I am the inedible hunk. The monster ran around the school eating everything in sight. Munch. Help, the inedible hunk just ate up 15 folding chairs and the gym teacher. Oh no, not folding chairs. This looks like a job for tra-la-la. Captain Underpants. Captain Underpants shot lots of underwear at the monster, but it didn't do any good. Zip. Munch, munch. So Captain Underpants took off running. The inedible hunk chased him. Grr, help! And chased him and chased him. Finally, the inedible hunk got too tired and thirsty to chase Captain Underpants. How about a nice drink of water? So the monster took a long drink from a shiny white bowl. Gulp, gulp, when suddenly, flush! Hooray for Captain Underpants! And so the inedible hunk got flushed away and was never heard from again. Tra-la-la! The end. Don't miss our next exciting adventure, Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets, coming soon to a playground near you. Chapter 4, Mean Old Mr. Krupp. Do you see that old guy looking out the windows up there? That's Mr. Crump, the principal. Now, Mr. Crump was the meanest, sourest old principal in the whole history of Jerome Horwitz Elementary School. He hated laughter and singing. He hated the sounds of children playing at recess. In fact, he hated children altogether. And guess which two children Mr. Krupp hated most of all? If you guessed George and Harold, you're right. Mr. Krupp hated George and Harold. He hated their pranks and their wise cracks. He hated their silly attitudes and their constant giggling. And he especially hated those awful Captain Underpants comic books. I'm going to get those boys one day, Mr. Krupp vowed. One day very, very soon. Okay, so that's just a little bit of what Dave Pilkey writes. And, like, he can relate to kids so much. First, the disgusting lunches that kids hate most of the time. Two, he talks about things that kids are told not to talk about because it's so inappropriate, but they think it's funny. Kids think that underwear is funny. They think poop's funny. They think wedgies are funny. And a whole bunch of adults tell them not to talk about that because it's so inappropriate. But Dave just lets them read what they think is funny. He lets them see the humor and what they already think is humorous. And so he just makes kids think it's okay to think about those things and to think what they think is funny is alright. He also relates to the troublemakers like George and Harold. Like George relates to his writing side, while Harold relates to more of his drawing side. Those two boys are Dave, but just into two people instead of one. I think Dave shows that anyone can be a hero in his themes, and that even like the dog and Dogman, or the baby and Super Diaper Baby, or Mr. Krupp and Captain Underpants. He just shows them that it's alright to be anything that they want to be. And anyone can be a superhero, even you. For an activity, I would have the kids, we'll probably take about 3 or 4 days, and I would just have the students make their own comic book. Day 1, we might brainstorm about it, brainstorm about some situations that we might have. Day 2, we might start writing just a little bit, trying to get those characters and situations put together, and so that they can like see how they want it to end. Day 3 would be our rough draft. We would write the rough draft. We would see if it needed any editing. We would make sure that everything's spelt right. Dave Pilkey doesn't spell things right, but it's so that kids can see the humor in that also, because everything is supposed to be spelt right. Well, they see that it's spelt wrong, and that's also humorous to them. But day 3, we would just edit it, make sure it looks right. And day 4, I would have them present it to the class, and like George and Harold do with their own comic books. I would have them present to the class, tell them how they got the idea, tell the students about the situation that the superheroes and how they came up with that superhero maybe. And then they would just go around the room and share their ideas. I really do think Dave Pilkey is an inspiration to students. He shows them that's okay to be a writer, an illustrator, a daydreamer. Just be what you are good at, and don't let anyone tell you that you can't do something. Like his teacher, she told him that he would never be a comic book artist, and to stop doing that. But then he proved her wrong. He became one of the most famous comic book writers for children. and I think he truly is an inspiration. Thank you.